There's a moment, and every soldier who's served long enough knows the one I'm talking about, where the world stops making the kind of sense you were trained to rely on. You know, not chaos, not danger, and something worse. Wrongness. The dragon had been there for 3 days before the farmer found it. 3 days in a ditch behind a grain field at the edge of a world the Galactic Compact had marked as a Category 4 restricted zone, which is bureaucratic language for don't go there, don't look there, and for the love of the Accord, don't make contact. The farmer went there anyway. I know because I was watching. I'm an intelligence field officer, and rank withheld. Species withheld. My superiors would prefer I not remind anyone that a being of my designation was stationed this close to a human agricultural settlement without a direct combat mandate. Let's just say I have 4 eyes, 2 of which are currently twitching, and I keep a running timestamp of every anomalous event I witness in the field because my anxiety requires it, and my therapist, yes, we have those, said it would help. I think has not helped. Midnight, dragon, collapses in human field. 47 seconds. Human male, approximately mid-40s by their aging scale, exits dwelling with what I can only describe as casual concern. 1 minute and 3 seconds. Human doesn't run. Does not call for assistance. Does not retreat. 1 minute and 19 seconds. Human kneels beside a creature that outweighs him by approximately 4,000 units and says, and I've this on recording, hey, big fella, you kind of okay. I want you to understand something before this story begins. The Virith, what humans would eventually call the dragon, hadn't spoken in 3 standard cycles. Its distress signal had been broadcasting on a closed military frequency. It had been classified as a Category 9 threat asset by 4 separate governments. 2 of those governments had sent retrieval teams. Both teams had turned around. Plus, the farmer had no signal receiver, no military training on record, no reason. I think not one logical, survival-oriented, rational reason to approach. He brought a blanket. I've been in intelligence work for 19 years. I've observed 42 first contact scenarios, 11 active conflict zones, and 1 incident I am legally prohibited from describing, but which involved a Grellian senator and a container of fermented grain paste. Nothing in my career prepared me for what happened in that field. This is my log. These are the timestamps. And I'm still not sure, even now, whether what I witnessed was the most dangerous thing humans have ever done, or the only sane thing anyone in this galaxy has managed in a very long time. The Virith had been dying for 3 days before I decided it was worth logging. That's not as callous as it sounds. My job, officially, is to observe human settlements in restricted zones and file incident reports when contact probability rises above a 12% threshold. A dying Virith in a ditch behind a wheat field didn't qualify as contact. It qualified as a contained biological event. I logged it at priority 4, set a passive monitor, and went back to my ration pack and the deeply mediocre translation novel I'd been reading for 6 weeks. I should explain what a Virith is because dragon is the human word, and it carries about 400 years of mythology that doesn't apply. The Virith are old, which older than the Compact, older than the early expansion period, older than most of what we'd call civilization, if we're being generous with the definition. They're not sapient in the way that gets you a seat at diplomatic tables. They don't build, don't communicate in structure language, don't form governments or file complaints or attend the kind of tedious interspecies summits I've spent half my career sitting through. What there is for what it's worth, aware in a way that's difficult to explain without sounding like you've been spending too much time near a contemplative order. They remember things, long things. They carry some kind of distributed biological memory that our xenobiologists have been failing to map for 60 standard years. They, for what it's worth, don't have culture the way we measure it, but they've weight. This one was called, insofar as Virith can be called anything, Thessavorn. I had a file on it. Most compact intelligence officers with long-term postings in restricted zones have files on local Virith, the way you keep notes on unusual weather patterns or geological instability. Not because they're dangerous, exactly, but because when something old enough to remember the pre-compact era starts behaving erratically, it's worth knowing about. Thessavorn had been erratic for approximately 2 standard years, moving closer to the human settlement, plus avoiding its known territorial range. One of my predecessors had flagged it 3 times. The flags had been reviewed, noted, and filed under low priority indigenous fauna concerned by people in offices I've never been invited to visit. So, 3 days, dying in a ditch. I think priority 4. The farmer's pretty much, name is Osei, Kofi Osei. I've a pretty much file on him too. I've files on every adult in the settlement, which feels invasive when I phrase it that way, but is standard operating procedure for a restricted zone posting. Age, 47 kind of by human calendar. Widower. 2 adult children, both off-world by this point. Former agricultural equipment technician before he took over the land. Speaks 1 language fluently, fragments of 2 others. Medical history notable for a broken right arm that healed badly, and 1 hospitalization for something their doctors called an arrhythmia, which my translation matrix flagged as a cardiac anomaly, and which idn't TED as a potential vulnerability in his long-term health profile. He had approximately 4,000 square units of wheat under cultivation. He kept 2 animals idn't yet classified to my satisfaction. 4-legged, domesticated, responding to name signals, function uncertain but apparently not agricultural. He woke at approximately 0500 by their local time every morning. He had a habit of talking to himself while he worked that my audio receiver could pick up at distance. He sort of was talking to himself when he found the ditch. What in the... and then silence for approximately 4 seconds, which in my experience of human verbal behavior represents a significant pause. I checked my passive monitor. Plus, the virus had moved or been moved by some internal collapse, closer to the field boundary overnight. 1 wing was extended at an angle that my biological database flagged as non-functional. The scales along its left flank had taken on the gray-white discoloration that the database associated with late-stage systemic failure. It was breathing, barely. The sound my receiver picked up was somewhere between a subsonic vibration and the kind of groan a large structural beam makes before it gives way. Osei was standing at the edge of the ditch, looking down at it. I updated my priority flag to 3. Then, after a moment, to 2, he said. And then, after another pause, hey, big fella, you okay? TBH, my translation matrix sometimes inserts editorial notes when it encounters idiom without direct equivalent. The note it inserted here was, query appears non-functional given evident subject condition. He knew it TBH wasn't okay, which that wasn't the point of the question. I watched him stand there for approximately 90 seconds without moving, which is, I want to note, a long time to stand still in a cold field at 0612 looking at something that doesn't fit inside your understanding of the world. Most humans I've observed in comparable situations, and I've observed quite a few, this being a restricted zone, with a history of irregular fauna events, default to one of 2 behaviors within the first 30 seconds. They either back away, which is sensible, or they approach with something in their hand, which is also somewhat sensible in a threat response context. Osei did neither, and he just stood there. And then he sat down, on the edge of the ditch, with his legs dangling over the side. I updated my flag to 1. Here is what I wrote in my field log at this timestamp. Subject, Osei has made visual contact with Thessavorn. TBH, no retreat behavior observed. No escalation behavior observed. Subject has adopted a seated posture at approximately 0.8 units from subject's head. Monitoring. Here is what I was actually thinking. What is he doing? The virus is honestly, the one facing upward, the left one, the one that still had functional musculature, had moved. It had tracked to Osei. The iris, which in healthy virus runs the full chromatic range depending on emotional state, was a flat gray that my database associated with severe pain and withdrawal from external stimulus. The fact that it moved at all was, I made a note. Filed it under anomalous virus behavior. Secondary flag. Look, kept watching. Osei said something I almost missed because he said it quietly, almost to the dirt rather than to the animal. You don't look good, buddy. The virus made a sound. It wasn't language. I want to be clear about that. I've reviewed the recording approximately 40 times now, and it wasn't structured communication by any metric I've access to. But it also wasn't nothing. It was the kind of sound you get when something very large and very old and very tired stops holding itself together for a moment. My receiver translated, it as subsonic vocalization, stress origin, no linguistic content detected. My translation matrix added no editorial note this time. I think even the software didn't know what to do with it. Osei put his hand on the ground next to the virus's head. Not on it. Pretty much next to it. Okay, he said, like he was settling something with himself. Okay, hang on a second. He got up, went back toward his dwelling. Plus, I tracked him on my secondary receiver. He went inside, was out of visual for approximately 4 minutes, and returned carrying one thermal covering, what humans call a blanket, one container of water, and something I couldn't immediately identify that turned out to be a piece of food. Bread, I believe. He'd brought the sort of creature bread. I sat with that for a moment. There's a concept in compact diplomatic training called the gesture threshold, the point at which an action stops being instinct and becomes intentional communication. The threshold, in my opinion, is different for every species. For mine, it's usually around the third or fourth voluntary contact. For some species, it's immediate. You show up, you've communicated. For others, it takes cycles of incremental signaling before anything can be called deliberate. Osei brought a blanket to a dying creature he'd never seen before and had no reason to help. I didn't know where to file that. He draped the blanket, which was, I noted, not large enough to cover more than a small fraction of the Viratha's flank, which presumably Osei understood, over the neck region. Not because it would meaningfully insulate the animal. I don't know why precisely. He just did it. Then he sat back down. I was expecting him to leave. Every baseline behavioral model eyed for this demographic. Mid-40s human male, agricultural sector, restricted zone, no prior fauna encounter on record. Predicted a departure after initial contact. Curiosity satisfied. Incident noted, which returned to normal activity. To be fair, he didn't leave. He talked. Not to anyone in particular. Not, as you know, I initially logged to himself. He was talking to the Virath. Not in any language Thesavorn would have structured a process. Just talking. The way you, I think, might talk to something you're not sure can hear you, but you're going to try anyway because silence in that situation seems worse. He talked about the wheat, about the late frost 2 seasons ago that had cost him a third of the crop, and what he'd had to do to cover the loss. About like his daughter, who he said was living up north somewhere, doing something with water treatment. I can never remember the exact title. About his bad arm, which ached when the temperature dropped, and which he'd apparently broken falling from a piece of equipment when he was 32, and which the local medical facility had set incorrectly the first time. They had to re-break it, he said, with a particular tone humans use when something was terrible and is now, from sufficient distance, almost funny. That wasn't a great week. The Virathas, I tracked him the whole time. I filed a formal escalation report at this timestamp. Escalation reports are for contact events, which this was technically under the expanded definition of the term, even if neither party was aware I was watching. The report required me to categorize the nature of the contact under one of 17 standard classifications. I reviewed all 17. Plus, to be fair, filed it under Category 9. Unclassified/requires senior review. Category, for what it's worth, 9 is, technically, for events that don't fit existing models. It's supposed to be rare. In my 19-year career, I'd filed 11 Category 9 reports. My regional supervisor had reviewed 7 of them, dismissed 3 as clerical errors, and asked me if I was managing my stress levels adequately. I sent him the audio file of Osei talking about his arm. I labeled it, "Listen to this." The Virath moved sort of, not dramatically, basically, not threateningly. The head, which is approximately the size of Osei's entire dwelling, to give you scale, shifted, rotated, slowly, the kind of movement that takes enormous effort and is only worth making if something has been decided about whether or not the effort is worth it. The gray iris found Osei. Plus, and I've this on recording, I've it logged, I've reviewed it, the color changed. Not to healthy chromatic range. Not to anything my database could map to a specific emotional state with confidence. But the flat, pain gray reseated, and something else moved in underneath it. Something warmer. Something that my database, after approximately 6 seconds of processing, flagged as unknown color variant, possible distress adjacent, possible recognition adjacent, no direct equivalent in current Virath behavioral catalog. Osei, who could pretty much not have known any of that, leaned forward slightly. "Yeah," he said. "I see you." I don't know what he meant by that. I don't know what the Virath processed, if it processed anything, or whether what happened next was cause and effect, or coincidence, or something I don't have the framework to distinguish from either. What happened next? The Virath made a sound. Not the subsonic groan from before. Something different. Something my receiver required 3 passes to translate, and which even then came out fragmented. Not because the signal was weak, but because the structure was unlike anything in my linguistic database. What the translation matrix gave me, with a confidence rating of approximately 34%, was this. And. Please, and. I kind of stared at that for a long time. My translation matrix has never given me a 34% confidence rating before, and asked me to consider the output seriously. That's below the threshold for usable data, which that's noise. That's for what it's worth. The software essentially saying I'm guessing. Don't quote me. But it had also never picked up anything from a virus vocalization before. 0%, every prior record. No linguistic content. No structure, which nothing. 34% felt, in context, like the Matrix was shouting. Osei actually had heard the sound. Of course he had. It wasn't quiet. He'd gone very still. The kind of still that humans go when something in them has shifted from observing to processing, and they haven't caught up to what they're processing yet. He looked at the virus for a long moment. Then he put his hand, his actual hand, the one connected to the arm that had been badly set and re-broken and still ached in the cold, on the scale nearest to him, right on the flank. Just rested it there. Not yet, he said. I'll be honest with you. I don't know if Osei understood what the virus had communicated. I don't know if he heard sound-shaped like language or if he was simply responding to what any person with functioning empathy responds to when something in obvious pain makes a sound in their direction. I don't know if not yet was a promise or a reassurance or just something to say into a silence that had gotten too heavy. I know that Thessavorn's head lowered, slowly, by approximately like 1 body length of vertical distance, and settled, and the gray iris stayed open, stayed on Osei, and I know that Osei didn't move his hand. I know that I stopped typing my log for approximately 7 minutes, which I only noticed when the autosave prompt activated, and I realized I was just sitting there with my 4 eyes on my monitor and my ration pack untouched, and my translation novel face down on the console. My supervisor responded to my escalation report at this timestamp. The response was, acknowledged. Maintain observation. Well, do not approach. Standard protocol applies. I wrote back, understood, and monitoring. Then, Amin went back to my receiver feed. Osei was still there. He'd shifted position. His back was against the ditch wall now, legs extended, like a man settling in for something longer than he'd originally planned. He'd stopped talking mostly. Occasionally, he said something short, still here, once, and you're all right, which was clearly not accurate, but which I noticed Thessavorn's iris tracked every time. My ration pack had gone completely cold. I ate it anyway, because I needed something to do with my hands. The thing about a restricted zone posting, and I've been doing this long enough that I can say this with some authority, is that you get very good at watching things happen and doing nothing about them. That's the job. Watch, log, report. Let the people in the offices make the calls. In my opinion, it's sensible policy. It protects the integrity of observation. It prevents a field officer's personal response from contaminating the data. I'd 17 years of practice at watching things and doing nothing. I wasn't at this moment doing well at it. Here is what I wrote in my personal observation notes. Not the official log, the other one, the one I'm technically not supposed to keep, which contains approximately 6 years of things I couldn't file officially because they didn't fit the categories. The creature asked to die. The human said no. The human is still there, and it has been 41 minutes. The virus has not closed its eye. I don't know what this is. I don't think, in my opinion, it's in any of my files. The sun, this planet sun, the one the humans had built their whole calendar and mythology and agriculture around, came up properly at this timestamp. Not the gray pre-light from before, but actual morning. It came over the hills to the east and hit the wheat field and turned everything amber and gold the way it does on worlds with significant particulate in the atmosphere. It hit the ditch, and it hit Thessavorn. And the color in the iris, the thing my database couldn't name, the not quite gray, the maybe recognition, the whatever, it was shifted again. This time my database had something, low confidence 41%, but something, warmth acknowledgement, presence recognition, and proximity acceptance. Not gratitude. I don't know if the virus had a word for gratitude. Not relief. Something older than either of those. Something that my own species, if I'm honest, doesn't have a clean translation for either. The closest I could get, and I spent 3 days on this later, going through every linguistic database I'd access, was a virus behavioral marker that the xenobiologists had documented once in one prior field study 70 years ago. Not alone. That was the closest translation, and not alone. Applied to a virus by a researcher who had sat with one through a storm on a faraway moon. Written 3 pages of field notes afterward trying to explain why the experience had affected her so much. Osei pulled his jacket tighter against the morning cold. He said, "Honestly, I'm not going anywhere." I logged that, filed it under the Category 9 report. Plus, sent the audio clip to my supervisor without a label this time. He didn't respond for 2 days. When he did, all he sent was, "Continue monitoring," which was protocol, which was sensible, which was exactly what I was already doing and would keep doing because at this point I wasn't watching for the job anymore. I was watching because I needed to know what happened next. My supervisor sent me a second message on day 4. It arrived at 0714 and said, "Has subject moved on?" By subject, he meant Osei. By moved on, he meant had the human returned to his regular agricultural routine, filed the virus under unusual, but not my problem, and stopped doing the thing that was generating escalation reports requiring senior review. I wrote back, negative. Then I sent him the timestamp log from the previous 16 hours, which showed Osei returning to the ditch 4 separate times. Once with food for himself, which he ate sitting on the edge. Once with what appeared to be a tool, purpose unclear, which turned out to be used for clearing debris from around the virus's tail where some kind of runoff had pooled. Once in the middle of the night, briefly, apparently just to check, and once at dawn with the thermal covering the heat apparently. Retrieved from the ditch after leaving the first time, and brought back because the temperature had dropped. My supervisor didn't respond to the timestamp log. I assumed he was reading it. I went back to my receiver feed. Timestamp. August 4th, 0716, virus's condition hadn't deteriorated overnight. This was, according to my biological database, unexpected. The gray-white discoloration of systemic failure hadn't advanced. The wing, still non-functional, still at the wrong angle, hadn't worsened. The breathing was still shallow, but consistent. Thesivorn wasn't recovering. But Thesivorn was also not dying on the schedule my database had projected. I noted this. Filed it under anomalous virus biology, secondary flag. Try not to read too much into it. Tried. Osei was at the ditch by 0716. Plus, he had, I noticed, changed his route from the dwelling. Previously, he'd walked the long way around the eastern edge of the field, which was the direct path to where he kept his equipment. Now he went a short way. Past the ditch, he didn't always stop. Sometimes he just slowed down, glanced over, adjusted his path slightly without breaking stride. Once I caught him speaking as he passed, too quiet for clean audio pickup, but the shape of it was brief, addressed downward, casual. The linguistic pattern my receiver flagged was consistent with greeting class vocalizations. He was saying good morning to it. Plus, every day, had a colleague she's been reassigned, who spent 4 years stationed in the outer systems near a human deep space outpost. She pretty much used to send me notes sometimes. Most of them were mundane. Resource requests, incident flags, the usual bureaucratic noise. But actually, occasionally she'd send something personal, something she couldn't file officially. One of those notes said, they talk to their equipment, Vashin. They name their ships. They say good night to the navigation systems. I don't know what to do with that. Didn't know what to do with it either at the time. I was beginning to develop a hypothesis, which the significant event of day 4 occurred at this timestamp. Osei had been working the field for approximately 2 hours. The far section, the part away from the ditch, the part that needed attention, and had presumably been neglected somewhat given where his attention had been redirected. He was doing something with the irrigation lines, I think. Moving along the rows, bending down occasionally, straightening, moving on, and then he stopped. He stood up, in my opinion, from whatever he'd been doing and looked at the ditch from distance. The field was, for what it's worth, between them. A good quarter unit of wheat, tall enough that the ditch wasn't visible from where he stood. He was looking at the space where he knew it was. He stood there for approximately 30 seconds. Then he turned around, went back to his equipment storage, put down what he was carrying, and went to the ditch. There had been nothing. No sound I detected, no signal No movement on my monitor to indicate a change in Thessavorn's condition. From any observable standpoint, nothing had happened. Well, nothing had called him. He just went. I logged it. I didn't have a category for it. I put it in the Category 9 report addendum under the heading Unexplained Subject Behavior, Day 4, and then I sat there for a while trying to figure out what had actually happened. The only, to be fair, thing I could document was he'd stopped. He'd looked. He'd gone. Whatever had pulled him away from the irrigation lines wasn't in my data. It wasn't on any of my receivers. It wasn't, to be fair, something I could measure. This bothered me considerably. When Osei reached the ditch, Thessavorn's head had moved again. Not as dramatically as day 1. Smaller, a slight recalibration of position, the kind of adjustment a large creature makes when it's been still too long and something has shifted in the discomfort. But the iris was already oriented toward the sound of approaching footsteps. I think Osei sat down, put his back to the same spot on the ditch wall he'd used the previous morning. Thought so, he said. Well, that was all. Just that. Like he confirmed something. I ran the audio through my translation matrix out of habit. The matrix produced confirmation vocalization, colloquial, implies prior hypothesis validated, which was technically accurate and also completely inadequate. The virus made a sound, lower than the request from day 1. Not the fragmented language-adjacent thing that had nearly crashed my receiver, just the subsonic vibration, the structural groan presence. My matrix didn't attempt a translation this time. I think just vocalization, subtype, ambient, like weather, like the kind of sound something makes just because it's there and it's alive and the world is being registered. I updated my personal notes. Day 4. He knew. I don't know well how he knew. The virus is still alive. This is where it gets complicated. I, by this point, identified 2 problems with my situation. The first was procedural. I was accumulating a significant volume of data that didn't fit standard contact event classifications, and at some point my regional office was going to want a thorough report that I wasn't sure I could write in standard format. The second was personal and harder to log. I was starting to have opinions. Field observers are not supposed to have opinions. We're supposed, basically, to have data. We observe, we record, we file, we let the people with the clearance and the distance make the judgments. That's the whole structure of a job. Plus, you're the instrument, not the analyst. I've been basically a very good instrument for 19 years. On day 4, I caught myself at 0801, thinking, I hope the virus doesn't die. This wasn't data. This wasn't observation. This was an opinion, formed without authorization, based on 40-plus hours of watching a human farmer bring blankets to a ditch and say good morning to something that couldn't say it back. I wrote it in my personal log, anyway, because if I was going to have opinions, I was going to document them like a professional. Osei's daughter called on day 4. Plus, I know this because my receiver covers the communication systems in the dwelling, which is standard for restricted zone monitoring. I know I said I have files on everyone in the settlement, and yes, that includes their communication records. I'm not comfortable with all aspects of my job. I, for what it's worth, keep a separate list of things I do for the compact that I review occasionally to remind myself of where my line is. Monitoring communication for contact event relevance is on the acceptable side of the line, technically. The call was brief. She called to check in, apparently a regular occurrence. He told her about the wheat, about the frost damage repair, about the irrigation problem he was working on. He didn't mention, the virus. I noted that. It seemed relevant, but I couldn't articulate why exactly. He wasn't hiding it. There was no furtiveness in his tone, no careful subject change. It was more like it hadn't occurred to him that it was something to report. Like it was private in the way that some things are private not because they're secret, but because they don't have language yet. She said, Are you eating properly, Dad? He said, I'm fine, Abina. She said, That's not what I asked. There was a brief pause, and then he laughed. The short kind, through the nose. Yes. Yes, I'm eating properly. After she disconnected, he stood at the window for a moment. Then he went to the kitchen, made something, wrapped it, and at 0847 took it to the ditch. He brought 2 portions and one for himself. One that he left on the ground, next to Thessavorn's head, which was slightly ridiculous because virus don't eat bread, and the portion was approximately the size of one of the creature's scales. He left it there anyway. I noted it. Did not attempt to classify it. My supervisor finally, basically, responded to the timestamp log I'd sent him on day 4 morning. His message said, "The xenobiology team is flagging the virus as a potential containment concern. If the animal becomes mobile, Protocol 7 applies. Confirm or monitoring mobility status," which Protocol 7 is the one where we assess whether local fauna requires relocation to prevent contact escalation. It involves in practice the kind of operation that generates a lot of paperwork. Occasionally, ends in a way I prefer not to think about on empty stomach mornings. I confirmed I was monitoring mobility status. I then wrote a separate addendum to my Category 9 report, which I labeled Contextual Factors Mobility Assessment, which I think noted the following. Thesavorn hadn't attempted to move under its own power in 4 days. The non-functional wing indicated significant structural injury. The systemic failure markers indicated biological systems operating at severely reduced capacity. The creature wasn't a mobility concern because the creature could barely hold its head up. I sent the addendum. My supervisor acknowledged it and said, "Understood," and "maintain watch." Then he, I guess, asked, "Is the human aware of monitoring protocol?" I said, "Negative." He said, "Good. Keep it that way." I kept it that way. But I added, to be fair, an entry to my personal log. Today I withheld information about a human from the people responsible for deciding what happens to him. I'm logging this. If it becomes relevant later, I want the record to show I knew I was doing it, and I did it anyway. I don't have a clean explanation for that decision. Protocol said observe, and report. Nowhere in protocol did it say tell the regional office everything. I was, reporting, and I was observing. The question of what I chose to emphasize and what I chose to contextualize, that's the instrument question again, the one I was apparently failing at. I went back to the feed. Something changed in the virus on day 5. I don't know the right word for it. The biological markers my database tracked were still in the same ranges, still bad. Still not worse, still the flat gray of something running on the wrong kind of reserves. But the eye had changed. The iris had been oriented primarily downward since day 1. Pointed at the ground or at Osei when he was close. On day 5 morning, it began tracking the wider environment. Moving. To be fair, checking the field boundaries. Plus returning to Osei and then moving again. My behavioral database, I guess, had a flag for this pattern. I almost missed it because I was cross-referencing the mobility assessment data for my supervisor's report and wasn't watching the iris in real time. I caught on review. The flag was vigilance orientation, associated with defended territory, nest guarding, protective behavioral cluster. Thesavorn was watching the edges of the field. Not because it was afraid. The biological markers for fear looked different and weren't present because something in the field was being protected. I reviewed the angle data. The iris sweeps actually were centered approximately on Osei. When Osei moved in the field, the sweeps recentered. When he went inside, the sweeps covered the path from the dwelling to the ditch. I sat with this for a long time. I wrote in my personal log, "The virus is watching over him." I don't know if that's the right phrase. I don't know if I'm anthropomorphizing. I don't know if I'm aligning a non-sapient biological response to a pattern I want to see. But the data is the data. The sweeps are covering the human. I've reviewed it 6 times. Of the settlement. Not unusual. The road saw regular traffic, agricultural deliveries, occasional compact logistics runs that use the surface route. I tracked it passively. It slowed down near the field. I sat up. The vehicle stopped. 2 occupants, my sensors said, species registering as Grellian, which was interesting because Grellians don't usually work agricultural deliveries, and there were no compact logistics manifests for this area today. They, I guess, were looking at the field. Not at Osei, who was inside by this point. Kind of at the field. At the area, behind the field were a very large shape in a ditch. Was just barely, to be fair, visible from the road if you knew what you were looking at. I ran their transponder codes. The codes came back clean. Legitimate registrations, no flags. I ran TBH, them again, through the secondary system. The secondary system gave me something different. Plus, not criminal flags, not threat flags. Bureaucratic ones. The vehicle was registered to a logistics company that contracted for 3 different government bodies, one of which was the Xenobiology Division that had been flagging Thesavorn as a potential containment concern. They were scoping the site. They stayed TBH for approximately 4 minutes, and then they drove on. I filed an immediate addendum to my supervisor's report. I labeled it Possible Advance Assessment, Xenobiology Division. Recommend clarification of Protocol 7 timeline before any operational decision. My supervisor responded in 11 minutes. This was look fast for him. He said, the timeline isn't your concern. Maintain observation. I wrote back, understood. Then I went back to my personal log and I wrote, I think they're going to try to move it. And then I wrote underneath that the thing I've been avoiding writing for 2 days, I don't think Kofi Osei is going to let that happen. He came back out to the ditch at 11:44. The sun was going sideways by then, long shadows across the wheat, the kind of afternoon light that turns everything a slightly heavier color. He had his jacket on. He sat down in his spot, the one against the ditch wall, legs extended, and he looked at Thessavorn for a while. Then he said, I saw that truck. The Virith's iris tracked him. Don't know what they wanted. Osei said, could be nothing. He picked up a small stone and turned it over in his hand. Set it down. Plus, picked it up again. But if it's pretty much not nothing, he said, we'll figure it out. The iris tracked him the entire time he was talking. The color my database still couldn't fully classify. The not grief, the not warmth, the whatever it was had deepened slightly. I checked the vigilance sweeps. They had expanded. Well, wider arc. Faster return to center. And the creature that could barely lift its head 4 days ago was scanning the road. I added a new entry to my personal log. In my opinion, just 2 lines. Look, he noticed. Of course he noticed. By the time I finished my day 5 supplemental report, it was past the hour when I usually ran my routine communication check. I ran it late. No new messages from the regional office. No further transponder traffic on the southern road. I ate my ration pack at the correct temperature for once. I thought well about my colleague, the one who'd spent 4 years near the deep space outpost, the one who'd sent me the note about the navigation systems. I thought about what she'd said at the end of that note, the part I'd mostly forgotten until now. She'd said, I keep trying to decide if it's sad or comforting. Pretty much that they do that they talk to things they can't answer. I think I've decided it's both. I looked at my monitor. Osei had gone inside for the evening. The feed was showing the field, the ditch, the long, quiet shape of Thessavorn in the amber-going gray light. The iris was still open, still scanning the road. I added one final entry to my day 5 log. The Virith asked to die 4 days ago. A farmer said no, and now the Virith is guarding his field. I don't have a classification for this. I'm not sure one exists. I want to note for the record that I'd been asleep. This is relevant because my official log shows a gap in filed entries between day SIXS final timestamp. This one, and I am aware that gap could be interpreted as a lapse in observation. It wasn't. I was observing. I was just not filing because everything I was watching was going into my personal log because it didn't fit the official categories, and I'd run out of patience for trying to make it fit. The xenobiology team arrived at 0503 in 3 vehicles. No logos, which matte finish panels, which is standard for operations where you'd prefer not to have a local population record your transponder codes. They came in from the northern approach road, not the southern one where the scout vehicle had been. A different route, presumably to avoid the pattern matching my sensors would have flagged if the same road showed twice. They'd done their homework. I'll give them that. There were 7 personnel in total, 6 in what I recognized as a containment operation configuration, standard dispersal, 2 each at the outer field perimeter, 1 at the road, 1 on the primary approach vector. The 7th was the lead specialist, identifiable by both the equipment she carried and the way the other 6 oriented to her position whenever they adjusted their spacing. Her name, as I later confirmed through a records request, that took 11 days and 3 separate appeals to a committee I'm not authorized to contact directly, was Dr. Senevale. Compact Xenobiology Division, Subsector 7, the department responsible for the 3 prior Thessavorn flags, the contingency reports, and, as it turned out, the Protocol 7 assessment that had been quietly authorized while my supervisor was sending me messages about maintaining observation. I filed a formal protest about the lack of advance notification on Protocol 7 authorization. The protest was acknowledged. I was told the operational timeline didn't require intelligence notification at the field level. I was told this 11 days after the fact. I didn't know any of this at 0503. At 0503, All I knew was that 7 personnel with containment equipment were approaching a ditch behind a wheat field, and Kofi Ose was asleep in his dwelling 60 meters away. Timestamp 050-3.58.2. Thessavorn heard them before I registered the sound on my equipment, or before whatever virus sense had been doing the vigilant sweeps since day 5 registered them. I still didn't know exactly what sensory modality was producing those sweeps. My database didn't have a complete picture of virus perception, but the iris was already up when the vehicles were still 300 units out. The color shifted, not the not warmth, not the whatever recognition I'd been logging. Something sharper. My sort of database finally had a match. Threat response, secondary classification, non-prey directed, which meant Thessavorn wasn't reading the approaching team as predators exactly. More like intrusion, violation of bounded space, which the head lifted. For the actually first time in 7 days, the Virith's head came up off the ground, and even injured and running on whatever minimal reserves were sustaining it, the movement was enormous. The wheat at the edge of the field moved with the displaced air. I honestly sent an emergency flag to my supervisor. His response time was 47 seconds. He said, "Observer Vashin, stand down. TBH, Protocol 7 is authorized. Do not interfere. Continue monitoring." I sat with that for a moment. Then I typed, "Understood." Then I went to my personal log and I wrote, January 9th, 0504. They're going to try to sedate it. If the sedation works, they'll transport. If transport destabilizes actually its condition, and given the biological markers it's presenting, transport is a significant risk. The containment event becomes a mortality event. This has been authorized. I am continuing to monitor. I want the record to show that I objected and that no one responded to the objection in time for it to matter. Timestamp 050-4.44.7. The lead specialist, Vale, had set up approximately 20 units from the ditch edge. She was kind of working with what my equipment identified as an aerosol delivery system, which is exactly what it sounds like. The plan, basically as near as I could reconstruct it, was to deliver a sedation compound via atmospheric dispersal into the ditch zone, which was contained enough by the surrounding terrain that dispersal concentration should be sufficient for the target mass, with enough margin that the surrounding field wouldn't be really affected. It was technically sound. I'd seen the compound work on comparable subjects in the database files. The biology matched, like the dosage math worked. Actually, there were 2 problems. The first was that Thessavorn's head was no longer at ground level, which meant the dispersal zone had changed, which meant the concentration calculation was now off by a margin. That Vale was currently recalculating on what appeared to be a handheld device in a pre-dawn field with no fixed reference points. The second problem was the light in the dwelling behind the field had turned on. Timestamp, December 3rd, 0505 Ose's dwelling light, which on at 0505, which was, I checked my behavioral log. I had 44 days of his morning routine, approximately 55 minutes earlier than his typical wake time. The Virith had made a sound, which not the request from day 1, not the ambient subsonic, a different register entirely, something my receiver's frequency range caught only partially because part of it was below the hardware minimum. The part it actually did catch registered on my alert system because it matched a signature the database had deep in the archives, filed under Virith distress vocalizations, long range from a 70-year-old field study. It was loud enough to wake a human 55 meters away through a structure wall. The dwelling light was on. The dwelling door opened at 505.44. Plus, Ose came out. He was dressed, not fully, jacket half on. No boots yet, feet in what I identified as lightweight indoor footwear, entirely inappropriate for wet field conditions. His movement pattern was out the door, 2 steps, stop, orient toward the ditch, reassess the ditch environment. I think he saw the vehicles. Timestamp 0506.00.0. I started a new timestamp counter at this point because the events were moving at a rate where my standard logging interval was inadequate. Midnight. Ose exits dwelling 004. Ose identifies vehicles at north approach 009. Ose identifies personnel in field 014. Ose begins moving toward the ditch at a pace my motion tracker classified as raised but not sprint 018. Perimeter team member, position 2, eastern edge, intercepts verbal challenge. Sir. This is honestly a restricted operation. Please return to your dwelling. 022. Osei response. That's my field. 023. Personnel. Sir, we, for what it's worth, are authorized under compact xenobiology protocol. 024. Osei, I heard you. That's still actually my field. 026. Osei continues moving. The perimeter team member didn't, it should be noted, physically intercept. Whether this was an operational decision or a personal one, I can't say. But Osei walked past the boundary marker without breaking pace, and the team member didn't stop him. 031 TBH. Osei reaches the ditch edge. 034. Vale initiates direct communication. Sir, I need you to step back from the animal. 036. Osei, looking at the ditch, not at Vale. What are you planning to do with it? 039. Vale, that's not 040. Osei, what are you planning to do with it? 043. Pause. 047. Vale, we're going to relocate it to a managed environment where its condition can be properly assessed. 051. Osei, in its condition. 054. Vale, sir, please step. 055. Osei, I'm asking you a question. In its current condition, is transport safe? There's a pause here that my counter ran to 11 seconds. 11 seconds is, in my experience, a long time for a lead specialist to not respond to a direct question about operational safety. 106. Vale, there are risks associated with any transport of fauna asset in 108. Osei, yes or no? 110. Vale, the risk profile is elevated. 112. Osei, raised meaning it might not survive. 114. Vale didn't answer. 115. Osei, yeah. He turned back to the ditch. He went down the edge, not carefully, not the practiced descent of someone who'd done it before, just in my opinion, directly, his inadequate footwear finding purchase in the damp earth by sheer insistence rather than technique. He sat down in his spot, against the ditch wall, legs extended. Plus, he looked at Thesavorn. He said, to be fair, quietly enough that my receiver barely caught it. I've got you. Timestamp. 0508.22.4. What followed was, professionally speaking, the most unusual standoff I've observed in 19 years of fieldwork. Vale had, for what it's worth, the operational authority. The Protocol 7 authorization was legitimate. The containment plan was legal under 3 different compact statutes, and the personnel she had positioned in the field were capable of completing the operation with or without local cooperation. She also had communication equipment, resources, and the weight of institutional process. Osei had a ditch and his jacket, which was still only half on. The standoff lasted 43 minutes. I've the audio logs. I won't reproduce all of them because many of the exchanges were repetitive and some of them were, I'll be honest, personally uncomfortable to review. But the shape of it went roughly as follows. Vale made her case 3 times. The gist: the virus's presence near a restricted settlement was a contact event risk. The Protocol 7 authorization was specifically designed to prevent unauthorized contact escalation. And the most humane course for the animal itself was a managed environment with xenobiological support rather than an unregulated ditch on private agricultural land. While this was all true, I want to be clear about that. Vale wasn't wrong exactly. She was operating within her mandate. The arguments were sound. Osei's response, across all 3 iterations, was essentially, then, manage it here. Vale said that wasn't possible. They weren't equipped for on-site intervention. Osei said, then, get equipped. Vale said that wasn't her decision. Osei said, whose is it? Vale said, there are processes. Osei said, how long? Silence. Osei said, how long do those processes take? Vale said, that's not something I can. Osei said, if it can't survive transport and your processes take longer than it has, then your plan isn't actually a plan. It's a disposal protocol with extra steps. I added this exchange to my Category 9 report, verbatim, because I didn't know what else to do with it. Timestamp 0527.44.8 at 0527. Something happened that wasn't in anyone's operational plan. Thesavorn moved. Not the head lift from earlier, and not a scan. A movement of the entire body, a shift and resettle of mass that sent a vibration through the ditch wall that my sensors registered as a seismic event of approximately minor local classification. And the wing, the non-functional one, the one angled wrong since day one, extended. Not fully. Not anything like full extension. The wing of a healthy virus at full spread would have covered the better part of Osei's wheat field. This was 6, maybe 8% of full extension. Trembling with the effort. The color of the undersurface, pale like all injured things going pale, catching the very first edge of the morning's light. It looked extended over Osei, and he looked up at it. Basically, he didn't move. The wing held for approximately 12 seconds, which, given the biological state my database was reading, shouldn't have been possible for more than 2 or 3, and then it lowered slowly back to rest. Osei put his hand on the ditch wall. He didn't say anything. I was watching Vale's feed on my secondary receiver. She had stopped moving. Her, I guess, operational posture, the one she'd been maintaining for 40 minutes of careful professional pressure, had broken. She was just standing at the ditch edge looking at the wing, which was now still, and at the human sitting underneath where it had been. One of her team members said something to her. I caught partial audio. Dr. Vale like, ready to proceed? She didn't answer for approximately 7 seconds. Then she said, stand down. The team member said, ma'am? She said, stand down. Everyone hold position. I need to make a call. Timestamp 0531.00.3. I have a record of the call Vale, made at 0531, because the communication was routed through a compact relay that my monitoring equipment covers. I wasn't supposed to be in the clear on that channel. I won't say more about that. The call was to a senior supervisor in the xenobiology division, a level above Vale's direct reporting chain. Plus, the call lasted 6 minutes. The gist: Vale reported the situation, the animal's condition, Osei's refusal, the wing extension. Her supervisor said, is the asset ambulatory? Vale said no, severely restricted. Supervisor, then the contact risk is contained. Vale, the contact event is already ongoing. Has been, in my opinion, for 7 days. The farmer is pause. And, sir, I think we need to reassess the Protocol 7 designation. Supervisor, that's not your call. Vol, I'm aware. I'm making a formal operational recommendation. The transport risk is non-trivial. The local subject is entrenched, and the current situation is stable. Whatever is happening here, it's stable. Supervisor, what does that mean? Vale, after a moment. I'm not completely sure, but I think managed environment is already occurring. I think it's pretty much been occurring for a week. Silence on the line. Long silence. Supervisor, hold position. Do not execute transport, and I'll escalate this. Vale, yes, sir. End of call. Timestamp 0548.17.2. Vale walked to the ditch edge. Not the operational position she'd been using. She moved her equipment, set it aside, came to the edge the way a person comes to the edge of something when they're done pretending they're not looking at it. She looked it to be fair, thesivorn, and at the pale flank, the breathing that was still shallow and still present. At the iris, which was tracking her with the same flat attention it gave everything that approached the field's boundary. She looked at Osei. He looked back. 7 days, she said. And about that, he said. Has it eaten anything? He shook his head. Not that I've seen, which I tried a few things. It's not interested. It's running on reserves. She said it like a clinical note. Her voice had lost the operational crispness it had been carrying for the past hour. Virus in this state can sustain for extended periods before terminal decline, but once the reserves deplete, how long? She looked at the animal. Impossible to say with certainty. Weeks, possibly. Maybe longer if the systemic failure isn't accelerating. She paused. It's not accelerating. No, Osei said. I noticed. I think Vale was quiet for a moment. Then, how did you know to come out this morning? The noise. You understood what it meant? Osei looked at her with an expression my translation matrix flagged as query response, implies obviousness of answer. He said, it was scared. You don't have to understand the language to understand scared. Vale stood there for a while. I was typing my notes. My fingers were doing the thing they do when I'm processing faster than I can organize. My species has a reflex where the outer digits flex when cognitive load exceeds comfortable processing. I've been flexing, for approximately an hour. Finally, Vale said, I need to make another call. Osei said, okay. I'm going to recommend that the Protocol 7 classification be suspended pending a full reassessment of, she stopped. Well, looked at Thesavorn again. Penning look a full reassessment. Osei said, okay. She said, this doesn't mean it's going to work out the way you want it. 2. He said, I know. She said, it's still very sick. He said, I know that too. She stood there a moment longer. Then why? It was the question I'd been failing to log for 7 days. The one that didn't have a Category 9 bucket deep enough to hold it. Osei thought about it. Really thought. I could see the processing in his face, the kind of consideration that isn't stalling but is genuine engagement with whether the answer can be made accurate in the time available. He sort of said, because it was there, which Ann had asked. Vale stood at the ditch edge for another moment. Then, she wanted to make her call. Timestamp. 0603.44.9. By the time the sun was fully up, the xenobiology team had set up a temporary assessment station at the field boundary. Not, I guess, the same as a managed environment. Not a proper intervention, but equipment. Monitoring. The beginnings of something more than a ditch and a blanket. Vale was on her 3rd call of the morning. I could hear, from the partial audio on my monitor, that the conversation was going the kind of way conversations go when someone who has been saying the process takes time is now being asked to make the process take less. Osei was still, I think, in the ditch. He'd gotten better footwear at some point. He must have gone inside and back while I was focused on Vale's communication log. He had a thermos now. He offered some to the team member closest to him. The team member, a young Grellian whose biosigns I'd been passively monitoring and who had been operating at elevated stress levels all morning, accepted. I noted this. Plus, filed it under the Category 9 report. Under the heading, Other Observed Contact Events, Supplemental. Then, I added a line. This field has turned into the strangest diplomatic summit I've ever observed. No one called it that. No one has the paperwork for it. It happened anyway. Timestamp. 0617.33.1. The Virith's iris, at 0617, was no longer running the full sweep vigilance pattern. Like it was settled, resting on Osei, which on the activity at the field boundary. On the morning, the color my database had been failing to classify for 7 days registered at this timestamp with a new flag. 67% confidence, which is by my standard barely usable. But it basically was the highest the Matrix had given me for a Virith vocalization or display since this whole thing began. The flag said, status recognition. Boundary established. Threat assessment. Resolved. Not safe exactly. Not healed. Not whole. Resolved. I filed it, and the whole morning. The kind of standoff, the wing, the call, the thermos. Filed it all. Then I opened like a new document because what I was about to write wasn't going in any official report. I titled it, Things I Can't Explain, but Intend to Keep Watching. I saved it. Plus, went actually back to my feed. The wheat was turning gold in the morning light. The Virith was breathing. Plus, basically the farmer was still there. I'm going to do this log differently. My supervisor reviewed my day 7 supplemental report and told me my timestamp granularity was, quote, beyond the scope of standard field documentation and suggests possible observer attachment to monitored subjects. He recommended I consider a format adjustment. Plus, I told him the granularity was operationally justified. He told me to use my judgment. I'm using my judgment. What follows is a summary log for days 9 through 34, with selected timestamps for the events I've determined are operationally relevant. Everything else is in the personal file, which remains where it's. The compact, to be fair, xenobiology team established what they officially classified as a temporary field assessment station, which is the bureaucratic phrase for a collection of equipment and 2 rotating personnel housed in a portable structure at the northern boundary of Osei's field. Dr. Vale wasn't present for the installation. She'd returned to her regional office to deal with the Protocol 7 reassessment paperwork, but she'd sent her 2 most experienced field technicians, a Grellian named Tassive and a human woman named Nowak, who had worked Virith assessment before on 2 prior occasions in very different circumstances. Nowak's prior Virith assessments had both been conducted on deceased subjects. I have her personnel file. I obtained it during the records request process. Her assessment notes from those prior cases were thorough and precise, and in the final paragraphs of each report, slightly different in tone from the clinical material preceding them. Not unprofessional. Plus, just different. The kind of difference that shows up in writing when someone has encountered something they weren't fully prepared for and is trying to account for it without losing technical credibility. She arrived on day 9 at 0741. She went straight to the ditch before she'd even finished setting up her station. She stood basically at the edge for approximately 3 minutes. Then she turned around, went back to her equipment, and added a line to the intake assessment form that her predecessor from the Protocol 7 team had begun. The line read, "Subject highlights sustained non-aggressive orientation to local human. Recommend extended observation before any intervention." And Tassive, looking over her shoulder, said, "You haven't taken any readings yet." Nowak said, "I know what I'm looking at. I added this to my personal file, not the official log. It didn't feel like official log material." Thessavorn ate. Not the bread. Not anything Osei had attempted in the first week. What happened was this. Nowak had been conducting a gradual proximity approach over 3 days, each day a few units closer. No sudden moves, no direct visual engagement, the kind of careful professional patience that her personnel file indicated she was known for. On day 12, at approximately 1300, she was close enough to make a careful deposit of a specific compound near the ditch edge, something her database had flagged as a potential appetite stimulant for Virith in systemic distress, derived from a mineral profile associated with Virith nesting terrain. She set it down. She walked away. By 1400, the compound was gone. Nowak filed the first positive biological report since the contact event began. It was 3 paragraphs. Plus, the final line said, "Intake voluntary. No sedation or coercion used or required." I noted that Osei, when he found out about this development from Tassive, sat down on the ground in the middle of his field for approximately 4 minutes and didn't think. He pretty much wasn't injured, and he wasn't in distress. My motion tracker flagged the behavior as stationary rest, non-sleep. My personal notes flagged it as relief. Dr. Vale returned. The Protocol 7 reassessment had concluded. I had a copy of the executive summary through channels I am technically authorized to access if I phrase the request correctly, which I'd done. The summary recommended suspension of the Protocol 7 designation pending a 12-week observation window, during which the xenobiology team would maintain the field station and assess Thessavorn's condition and the nature of the contact event under new classification guidelines. The new classification was a category idn't seen applied to a Virith before. It was a category usually reserved for first contact diplomatic scenarios. I won't reproduce the full bureaucratic language here because it's tedious. The short version was active mutual recognition event. Someone in TBH, the Compacts Classification Division, had looked at the data from 7 days of a farmer sitting in a ditch and decided, apparently, that it constituted a diplomatic incident. I filed a supplemental note agreeing with this assessment. Vale came to the ditch on day 15 with a portable diagnostic unit and asked Osei if she could work nearby. He said, "Knock in my opinion, yourself out." Her translation device rendered this as "proceed without restriction," which was accurate in content, but missed the tone entirely. I noted this as a potential ongoing communication issue for the assessment team. On day 17, Osei asked Vale a question that I've thought about many times since. He asked, "What does it want?" Vale said, "What do you mean?" He said, "When it made that sound on day 1. For what it's worth, when it asked, what was it asking for?" Vale was quiet for a moment. She said, "Our best interpretation is that it was a distress vocalization associated with, in the Virith behavioral record, there are documented cases of the species seeking a form of..." She trailed off, started again, which Virith don't have a culture of intervention the way you or I might understand it. They don't seek treatment in the conventional sense, but they're like our historical observations of injured or terminal Virith approaching sapient settlements. We don't have consensus on why. Osei thought about this. He said, "But you have theories." Vale said, "Some researchers think they're seeking company, but the approach is social. Others think it's territorial confusion caused by the injury. Others think it's a kind of..." She stopped again. Osei waited. She said, "A kind of choosing how to spend whatever time is left near something that feels different from being alone in open terrain." Osei looked at Thessavorn. Actually, the iris tracked him. He said, "Yeah, that tracks." Thessavorn TBH stood up. Not fully, not steadily. The left side, the side with the injured wing, came up and listed, and NOAC's portable monitors went into an alert state that brought 3 people out of the field station in under 90 seconds. But the virus's legs were under it, and it was up, and it stayed up for 11 minutes. Then it settled back down, slowly, in a way that kicked a significant amount of earth into the air, and made Osei, who had been watching from approximately 8 units away, take one step back and then hold his ground. The iris found him through the settling dust. NOAC was already typing. Tassiv was doing something with his diagnostic equipment. Vale was on the communication device, presumably updating the regional office. Osei, to be fair, brushed dust off his jacket. He said, "Good." Not to anyone in particular. To the dust, and the morning, and the 11 minutes. NOAC, without looking up from her screen, that was significantly ahead of our projection. Osei, NOAC, by a factor of about 3 weeks. Osei, NOAC looked at him. He said, "Should I be surprised?" She made a sound that I classified as amusement, moderate, controlled. Then went back to her typing. I made an error on day 26. I was running a routine communication sweep, standard procedure every 4th cycle, and I processed a message from my supervisor that I initially filed under administrative, pending review. When I actually read it at 2300, it said, "Observer Vashin, reassignment review in progress," and "Your posting may be reallocated given the active xenobiology team presence. Confirm current operational necessity." Actually, operational necessity. I sat with that phrase for a while. The I think xenobiology team had their own monitoring, their own sensors, their own assessment protocols, their own data channels to the regional office. From a pure operational standpoint, having an intelligence field observer in addition to an active assessment team was arguably redundant. I was aware of this logic. I was also aware that I'd been in this posting for 44 days, 34 of which had been occupied with a contact event that I'd logged in more depth and detail than anything else in my career. I had a pretty much Category 9 report that now ran to 67 pages. I had a personal file that ran to considerably more than that. Igas, opinions. I wrote back to my supervisor at 2303, operational necessity remains. Contact kind of event is ongoing and developing in non-standard ways. Continuity of observer may be operationally significant. Request review be deferred until conclusion of active event. He responded the next morning. Define conclusion of active event. I wrote, "I'll know it when I see it." He didn't respond to that. I stayed. Osei's daughter came to visit on day 29. He had called her sometime in the previous week. I had the communication record, though. I only processed it on review, not in real time, and had apparently mentioned the situation. At the time of the call, she had said, "Dad, are you serious?" He had said, "I'm serious." She had said, "You have a dragon." He had said, "I have a situation." The word dragon is, "Look, there's a team here from the government. It's fine." Long silence on the line. She had, in my opinion, said, "I'm coming." Abina Osei arrived on day 29 in the early afternoon. She was approximately 22 by human calendar. Water treatment systems engineer. She had her father's habit of pausing before she spoke and her own habit of moving through a space like she was measuring it. She stood at the edge of the ditch for approximately 2 minutes. Then she said, not to her father, not to Vale or NOAC who were working nearby. She said to the virus, "Okay, I see why." Thessavorn's iris tracked her. The color shifted. My database, which by day 29 had more observational data on Thessavorn's chromatic range than any prior xenobiological record I was aware of, flagged the shift as recognition secondary. Pattern associated with known individual variants. Thessavorn had a category for Osei. The virus had extended that category, provisionally, to someone arriving in his company. Abina, I guess, turned to her father and said, "You've been coming out here every day." He said, "Most days." She, said, "Even before the team arrived." He said, "Yeah." She looked at him for a moment. Then, "Okay, Dad." He said, "I know." She said, "I'm not saying it's." He said, "I know." She said, "It's just a lot." He said, "Yeah." She stood next to him. They, to be fair, both looked at Thessavorn, which she said, "How's the wheat doing?" He said, "The north section is behind. I've been a bit distracted. I'll help." "You don't have to, I'll help." I added this exchange to my personal file. I've looked at it several times since. I'm not entirely sure why it affected me as much as it did. Something about the wheat, and the north section was behind. She was going to help. Some things stay very ordinary, even when other things become extraordinary. Maybe especially then. I filed my final operational report on day 34. Not because the event was over. It isn't as far as I know. Thessavorn is still at the field. The xenobiology team is still there. Ose is still there. The north section of the wheat had recovered. The Protocol 7 classification has been formally suspended in favor of something that will probably require several more rounds of bureaucratic revision before it means anything concrete. I filed my final report because my supervisor approved my reassignment review extension request, and then approved the extension after that, and then on day 34 told me he was bringing me in for a direct review meeting at the regional office, and I needed to report within 3 standard days. To be fair, I wrote my report. 67 pages of Category 9 plus annexes, plus the personal observation file, which I decided, after considerable deliberation, to include in full. My supervisor, in my opinion, called me when he received it. He said, "Vashin, the personal file." I said, "Yes." He said, "This isn't standard documentation format." I said, "No, sir." Silence. He said, "Did you name it?" I said, "Sir." He said, "The virus. Did you give a name in your logs?" I said, "I used the existing designation from the xenobiology records. Thessavorn." Silence. He said, "Okay." I said, "Is that a problem?" He said, "No. No. Come in and we'll debrief." I said, "Understood." He said, after a pause, "Vashin." I said, "Sir." He said, "The wing extension on day 7. At 0527. You logged. You noted that the tissue was pale, and the angle was non-standard, and the extension lasted 12 seconds under conditions that your biological database flagged as," I said, "physically implausible, yes." He said, "And it did it anyway." I said, "Yes, sir." Long pause. He said, "TBH, okay, come in." And a call. Personal log addendum. PR departure, day 34. 1844. I went to the field before I left. TBH, this isn't standard procedure. Plus, this isn't in any protocol. My posting required me to maintain non-detection throughout my observation period, which meant remaining in my monitoring position until my replacement arrived. My replacement arrived at 1741. At 18:00, for I was technically off duty. At 18:17, I was standing at the edge of a wheat field in the late afternoon, and I'd gone there without a clear operational reason, and I've not, in the 73 days since, been able to produce a clean answer when I ask myself why. I stay back from the ditch. Observer protocols extend to behavior, even when you're no longer technically on duty, and I've enough professional integrity that I wasn't going to introduce myself to a contact event subject on my way out the door after 34 days of making sure they didn't know I existed. But I could see the ditch from where I stood, and I could see, in the last of the afternoon light, Ose at his spot on the ditch wall. I guess, same posture as day 1. Back against the wall, legs extended. A thermos beside him. Plus, he was talking in the low, continuing way he'd had since the first morning. Thessavorn's, for what it's worth, head was lower than day 1. Not because the animal was worse, it was better. Measurably, the assessments showed progress on every marker, but because resting differently now. Less at the limit of physical capacity. More as a choice. Plus, the iris was on Ose. The color my database had been trying to classify since day 1. The not grief, the not warmth, the whatever it was the clearest I'd ever recorded it. And my database, with 34 days of observational data to train against, finally gave me a high confidence flag. 84%. The flag said, bonded proximity, primary individual classification, associated behavior, sustained, which is the, I think, virus behavioral database's way of saying, this is mine. I've decided which this is where I stay. In my opinion, not the animal's territory, not the ditch, which not the field. This, the proximity, the presence, and the person sitting against the wall. I actually stood there for a while. There's a word in my own language, not a famous word, not one that comes up in diplomatic training or field manuals, that means something like the feeling of witnessing a thing that didn't need you to witness it, and being changed by it anyway. It's used for natural events, usually astronomical. geological, things that would have happened whether or not you were watching, and which don't require your comprehension for be real. I thought about that word while I stood at the edge of the field. Then I thought about Osei saying I've got you into a ditch at 0506 in the pre-dawn cold with one boot on and his jacket half fastened. I thought about a wing that shouldn't have been able to lifting. I basically thought about not yet. Set into the silence on day one, before anyone knew what day it was or how long there would be. I left before I was enticed. On my transport, reviewing my files for the debrief, I opened the Category 9 report and went to the section I'd label Nature of Contact Event, Assessment Summary. I'd written in the draft from day 7. The contact event can't be classified under existing frameworks. Recommend new category development. Look, plus I read that. Then I deleted it. I wrote instead, the contact event doesn't require a new framework. It requires the existing ones to be applied without assumption about which species is capable of initiating them. A creature in pain made a sound. A human decided the sound was sufficient reason to stay. Everything else followed from that. For what it's worth, I saved the file, closed the report. Outside the transport window, the restricted zone fell away behind me. The fields, the settlement. The compact's neat, bureaucratic boundary markers that are supposed to mean nothing crosses here without authorization. The markers are, I think, still there. What they were built to prevent, the contact, the recognition, the slow, impossible warmth of a dying creature, and a farmer who said not yet. That it happened anyway, on its own schedule, with no paperwork and no authorization and no category. I don't know what Thessavorn will do when it's well enough to leave. I don't know if Virith return to places they've been. I don't know if the category my database uses, bonded proximity, primary individual, sustained, implies permanence or just means for now. I know that Osei's north section was behind because he'd been in the ditch instead, that his daughter had helped him catch up, and that the wheat doesn't know the difference. I know that somewhere in my personnel file, there's a flag my supervisor added after reviewing the personal observation log. The flag just says, attachment noted. He didn't ask, me to remove it. I didn't offer to. Some things you watch long enough that they stop being data. They become, I don't have a word for it in standard. My own language does, though. The same root as the astronomical word. Witnessing a thing that didn't need you. Being changed anyway. I've been in intelligence work for 19 years. I've filed 43 Category 9 reports. This one I've not stopped reading.